welcome everybody to this great call. It is a fantastic pleasure to introduce to you Professor John Watson. He was my PhD supervisor, and I was enamored by his work on small businesses and accounting and some of his work on gender issues. We had the fortune of co-chairing the Diana Conference in 2012 in Perth. He's also a very, very active researcher in small businesses and in gender issues. He was the token male for the first Diana Conference, which is a research conference on entrepreneurship and gender issues and entrepreneurship. And John has worked and lived in Perth, Australia. So without further ado, he's also the author of several books and many, many articles. But I would let John tell his story. John, welcome to the call. It is a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Alicia. It's nice to be talking to people from the other side of the world. Yeah, Perth's a long way from anywhere.
Yeah, we're literally on the other side of the world. It's I think we're 15 hours behind you.
And, we're well in front of America over here. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So, John, let me start asking you this question about how did you get into studying gender issues and debt? How did you get into studying accounting, and how did you get into really analyzing your body of work?
A lot of things just happened by chance. As you mentioned, my background's accounting. I worked for Pricewaterhouse, then now PricewaterhouseCoopers, many years ago before going back to university and teach, etc. And I've maintained my links with the accounting profession. I think accounting is very useful. I think all students should know something about accounting, because it doesn't matter where you go, whether you go into small business or you go and work as a vet or whatever it is, having some accounting knowledge is useful. So my daughter thinks accounting's boring and I'm boring, but I think accounting's useful. How I got into entrepreneurship, and I love entrepreneurship, it came about by chance. I was going down to the city to have a meeting with the accounting profession, and I picked up a brochure while I was waiting in the lounge area for the meeting, and it was talking about the high failure rates for small businesses and how they could reduce their chances of failing if they got advice and help from accountants. And I thought that was great. Getting advice from accountants I thought was great, but it was the high failure rates that worried me, and some of the statistics they were reporting. And I'm going back probably 20 years now, but it was something like 50% of businesses fail in the first 2 or 3 years and 90% fail within 5 years. And it just didn't ring true to me. I just didn't believe those numbers. But I also knew the accounting profession, they must have believed the numbers. They wouldn't report something that they thought was false. I mean, they're reasonably ethical and they wouldn't do that. So there was obviously
some people would disagree, right? Okay.
Well, some might. I'm obviously biased, but so anyway, I decided to make that my PhD topic, look at failure rates and find out, what's the real situation? What percentage of small businesses actually fail? And so that's where it started. And the difficulty in small business or small and medium businesses, I'll just talk about small, it's easier, is the lack of data. With large businesses, you've got a lot of data. You've got the stock market data. You can find out what's happening to large businesses. But for small businesses, lack of data. And so as I probed and started collecting information, what became obvious was that a lot of these statistics on small business failure rates were fundamentally flawed. For example, in England, in Britain, their failure statistics were based on businesses registering for VAT. Now, I don't know what it's called in the US. In Australia, we call it GST. In UK, it's VAT. What's it called in the US? Sales tax. Okay. So businesses have to register for sales tax, or VAT as it's called in the UK. And then if you started a business, Alicia, something or other, and it was really successful and you decided you needed a partner, so you asked me to join you and we became Alicia and John Incorporated, your first business would go off the register, and then the new business, Alicia and John, would go onto the register, and then that would get classified as a failure of the first business and the birth of the new business. Mm-hmm. So obviously that was distorting the failure statistics. And I remember we had a lovely cake shop near us that we always went to for birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas. And it was a couple from Germany. It started this lovely cake shop and with all the German pastries. Oh, it was lovely. We missed them dearly, but they had a very successful business. They put their kids through private schools. They bought a lovely home in a very affluent area, and they retired with a lovely nest egg. But at the end of the day, they got to 65 or whatever, and they just closed the business. It's now a cafe. That gets classified as a failed business because the people retired, even though they made lots of money, because at the end of the day, they closed it. And so all these statistics were fundamentally flawed, and it does a disservice to potential small business owners, because people might see these statistics and think, you know, if 90% of businesses fail in 5 years, you know, I better not start. That's too risky. Whereas the reality is so different. With large businesses, if you sell your shares in a large company, that company is not considered as failing. But with a lot of these small business measures, if you sell your business to me, it's classified as a discontinuance. You've discontinued and I started a new business. And so you get these overstatements of the failure rates. And there's a lot of incentive. You know, when I visited our Small Business Development Corporation in Perth to try and get them on side to help, they didn't want to have a bar of it, because the last thing they wanted was to have this information that, oh, failure rates aren't as bad as we thought, because their funding, they go to the federal government and say, we need lots of money to help small business because they're failing at this horrible rate. So, you know, they weren't interested. And so there's a lot of incentives.
And I think it also could make sense to say that if the failure rate is very high, you're somehow shielded by, you know, the commonality of that. Well, it is okay to fail because most businesses fail, right?
Yeah, but not in a lot of countries. I know in America, in the US, you know, failure is almost a badge of honor, because you assume you've learned something and you'll do better the next time. But in a lot of countries, particularly Australia and in Asian countries, you know, failure, people like to go commit suicide because it's not good to, the stigma is very bad. So it can be a real problem.
And it happens in Latin America,
Yeah, and it can put people off starting a business if they think, oh, I've got a 90% chance of failing. That's too high a risk. I won't take it. And so you could potentially have a lot of businesses that don't start that would have been quite profitable, good businesses that boost the economy and all the rest of it. So, yeah, so that's what got me interested, Alicia.
What would you say it is the correct number? What would be the reasonable failure rate?
Well, it depends how you define failure. See, if you define it as bankruptcy for small businesses, it's probably less than 1% a year. It could, yeah. It's a hard question to answer because it depends how you want to define failure. And some businesses continue and earn very small income, and some people would say that's really a failed business, but it's continuing, so it's not classified as a failure because the owners keep plugging away. They barely earn a subsistence living, but you probably would consider that a failure, and others might. So it's not an easy question to answer, but there are risks. I mean, I would have thought 10 to 15% of businesses, the owners start and then get out for a variety of reasons. Maybe it wasn't as successful as they thought. Maybe they found better job opportunities working for somebody else. So yeah, 10 to 15% would be, I think, a more reasonable number, but it's not as simple.
A simple answer.
No.
Now, what about gender issues? What about, I guess we don't have a lot of data about many minorities, but we have a lot of data about women-led businesses and men-led businesses. What has been your experience with that?
Literature, having spent 5 or 10 years trying to debunk the myth that small business have high failure rates, then there was the emerging literature that women don't know how to run a business and they fail at a higher rate than men. And again, I want to spend some time trying to understand that, because again, it didn't make sense. There's no reason why a woman shouldn't be able to run a business just as well as a man. But the statistics, people use very crude analyses. So we know there's a growing number of women-owned businesses. That's growing very rapidly. So the average age of a woman-owned business tends to be much younger than for the average male-owned business, okay? Now, we know with failure, you're more likely to fail in the first 2 to 3 years. You find the failure rate goes up in the first 2 or 3 years, and then it goes down. So you're most at risk in the first 2 or 3 years. So if on average female-owned businesses are much younger than male-owned businesses, you're going to see more female-owned businesses discontinue. Yeah? So when you're trying to
continuing a business is not the same as failing.
Well, it depends what your reason is for discontinuing. But irrespective of what definition you use, you're going to find that women-owned businesses appear to fail at a higher rate than male-owned businesses. Once you control for age of business, then that doesn't apply. The female-owned businesses tend to be younger, so they appear to fail more often. But if you compare young female-owned businesses with young male-owned businesses, they fail at the same rate. If you compare old female-owned businesses and old male-owned businesses, they failed at the same rate. So a lot of these studies that were saying female-owned businesses fail more often than male-owned businesses, they didn't control for key variables such as age of the business. That's a critical one. But also industry is important. You get more turnover in certain industries, and so you need to control for industry.
So give us an example of that. Give us an example of what kind of industries are more prevalent in women-led businesses.
Well, the women-led businesses are more focused in the retail and the service area. And you find there's if you're starting a manufacturing company where men tend to be more focused, you don't start a manufacturing company for 3 or 4 years and then decide you're going to retire. That doesn't happen, because you've got to put a lot of money and infrastructure in. You're in for the long haul. But you can start a coffee shop, and I know people who do. They start a coffee shop, they'll run it for 3 or 4 years, and then they've had enough, they'll close it, they might do something else, and then maybe in a year's time they'll start another coffee shop. So if you're in service, you find there's a much higher turnover of businesses, not because they fail necessarily, because the person might have done very well for 3 or 4 years, but it's long hours, it's hard work, you make a lot of money, you tend to have to work in it yourself, you can't really employ people, there are risks when you do that, etc. So every industry is different, and you need to control for industry when you're doing these benchmarks. And the other thing which was also interesting, a bit of my finance background, women we know are more risk averse. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the caveman days. I mean, women were to look after the kids, and you didn't take risks with the kids. The men had to go out and find the food and shoot the wild animals, etc. That involves more risk. And so I think it's just in their DNA. Men take more risks. And that's been shown in the psychology literature, it's in the finance literature. So if you look at superannuation, women unfortunately tend to pick more conservative options. They're more likely to have their superannuation savings in low fixed fixed interest rather than shares.
Yeah, let me just interrupt you for the audience. Superannuation in Australia is the equivalent of the IRA, is a retirement fund. So when John talks about superannuation, he talks about funds that are invested to take care of us when we're retired. So it has been shown that women have a less risky profile in their investment.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the same applies in business, you see. So women aren't going to take the risks. So they're not going to get the high profile, the big winners, but nor are they going to get the big losses. So if you look at women-owned businesses and look at the profitability that they earn, they're much more stable. And the male-owned businesses will have high profits one year and then disasters the next and then up the next and so on. The women are more stable. So again, if you use a measure of profitability as a measure of performance without controlling for risk, then it looks like the male-owned businesses are doing much better. But once you control for risk, then they're doing the equivalent to the female-owned. And so there's a lot to understand when you're talking about performance and when you're comparing performance, and to just use superficial comparisons is very risky because you can draw the wrong conclusions. And again, that could lead a lot of females thinking, oh, female failure rate's higher than male, I better not start a business. And that would be a real shame because a lot of economies are being driven along by the growth in female entrepreneurship. It's really bolstering economic development, and it'd be sad to see that curtailed by this misinformation.
And then probably it would be hard for a woman who's finding support from their social networks on starting a business to know that it is more likely that they're going to start a small business or they're going to fail. So it is a compounding effect. So not only they feel that there's a very high risk of failure, what we discussed before, but also they feel that they are at a disadvantage for whatever reason. Because a lot of people don't understand, as you said, what is the failure rate or what are the conditions that define that the closing of a business. But also, a lot of people don't understand how to use the female attributes as a positive, as an advantage, or as an opportunity. Have you done any work around that? What are the good things about having a woman-led business?
Well, it's interesting. I haven't specifically looked at it, but when I ran some focus groups some years ago with a master's student, and we had both men and women in the focus groups, and we were asking them questions about performance and particularly about issues to do with raising money from banks, etc., which we will get to a little bit later. One of the things I still remember was this lady who was, and I think the gentleman might have been there as well, but she was doing the talking. Women do a lot of talking, men do a lot of listening. Anyway, it was interesting because they were a husband and wife team, and you get a lot of businesses that are husband and wife team. And she made the point that it was so good to have the husband there because he took some risk that she would never have taken, and they obviously worked out really well. But then the husband chipped in and said, yeah, it was really good to have the wife there because she held me back on some things that I might have done that I probably would have regretted doing it. So, you know, you've got this combination of attributes and skills. And one thing I haven't done, which I'd love to do, I've done research that compares male-owned businesses with female-owned businesses, as you're aware of. But what I haven't seen is comparing male-owned businesses with female-owned businesses, but also with jointly owned, male and female. Yeah. To see if having that diversity actually makes a difference, and I'm sure it does. I mean, in terms of networking, women should be a lot better at networking. You know, my wife is, and I'm sure you are. I know you are. In terms of the networking skills, the women are much better. Again, there's been a lot of research published, unfortunately, which suggests that banks discriminate against women, and they don't want to lend to women. Maybe because they think women-owned businesses fail at a higher rate than male-owned businesses. I don't know why they think that. But it rang warning bells with me, because it made no sense to me why a bank would discriminate against women. Firstly, we've got laws that go against discrimination, so they run big risks if they did discriminate against women. But as we just mentioned a while ago, women are more risk averse. Banks are not in the business of taking risks. They're not providing risk capital. That's your venture capitalists, etc. So they're not in the business of taking risks. So if I was a banker, I would much prefer to lend money to you than to lend to me, because women, on average, are going to be more risk averse. So they're not going to risk that money unnecessarily. So it didn't make any sense. So I've done some work looking at lending of male-owned businesses and lending to female-owned businesses from the banks. And again, it's when people do this simplistic analysis. For instance, if I just compared the average female business with the average male business, I would find that the male business had more bank debt as a proportion of the total funding for the business. Okay? And then some people jump to the conclusion, oh, that's because banks won't lend to female-owned businesses. That's why they have less debt than male-owned businesses. But then when I looked at it by age, for young businesses, there's very little difference between the amount of bank debt. It's about 15 to 20%. So if you're starting a business, the bank may lend you 15 to 20%, but you'll need to find the other 80% from either family or friends or from your own resources or whatever. So the banks, unlike a house, you want to buy a house, the bank will lend you 80, 90% because they know they've got a tangible asset there. If you don't repay, they come and repossess and sell your house. But if you've got a small business, a coffee shop or whatever it is, there's no tangible asset. I mean, there might be a bit of equipment, but it's limited. So they'll only lend 20%, let's say, at the start. But what I found is over time, as the bank gets to know you, they're probably prepared to lend you more. So at the outset, they don't know much about you. So maybe 15 to 20% they'll lend you. Over time, as you demonstrate you can run the business, you're generating profits, then the bank's likely to be prepared to lend you more. Now, the interesting is, for male-owned businesses, we find the debt level increases over time. But for female-owned businesses, the debt level reduces over time. Now, I believe that's because, again, women just don't like to have the debt. They don't like to put themselves at risk of having to repay loans to the bank. So they make a personal choice to reduce the debt levels. And so as they generate income from the business, they pay down the debt. The males tend to take the money they generate from the business and maybe invest it in other businesses or expand the business or whatever and take on more debt. But I can't see any evidence that banks discriminate against women. And yet a lot of the literature jumps to that conclusion, I think, on the basis of inappropriate analysis of the data. It doesn't make sense. But what women and men need to understand, that banks aren't in the business of taking risks. Banks don't necessarily understand your business, particularly if it's in IT or something. If it's a routine coffee shop, they might have a better chance, but depending on the nature of the business, they don't understand it. So it's very hard. They're not going to lend you too much money because they don't want to take the risk. So what you've got to do when you go to see a bank, you've got to be confident. You've got to try and explain to them the nature of the business and why you think it'll be successful. You've got to make sure you've got some security. You've got to make sure you're putting in a reasonable amount of funding, because if the bank knows you're putting 80% of the money on the line, then they're probably prepared to put 20% on because they know. But they're not going to put 80% if you're only putting 20%. So you need to go along. And one thing I've found in the failure rate research that might be relevant is small business owners that get advice from accountants regularly were less likely to fail and more likely to grow. And because accountants, for all their limitations, do see a wide range of businesses and do get lots of ideas that they can share. And so if you can find the right accountant and and you need to find the right accountant, because some accountants are just interested in tax compliance work. But there are a lot of good accountants out there that are much more broadly interested in your business. And if you could take your accountant along to the bank and have the accountant talk to the bank manager, they understand each other's language, that could also be very helpful. So there's a lot of things I think business owners can do, but most of us, a bit worried about going and fronting up to a bank manager and trying to explain things and in their language. So if you can get support from an accountant or from somebody, that could be quite helpful.
Well,
but just remember, sorry.
No, that's interesting, because we did a research in Latin America, and we found that most people would consider their friends as consultants or free consultants, or they would consider the advice of their friends, but they would not consider the advice of the accountants. They would only use the accountants for tax purposes. And what you say, it's a critical example of something that our audience can do right away. Talk to your accountant and consider your accountant as part of a person that can help you improve your numbers and run your business better. And take your accountant to your banker if you're going to talk to your banker in order to grow your business or to manage your business in a more efficient way. Right?
See, I see the accountant to the business in the same way I see your GP or your general practitioner or your doctor to you as a person. The doctor can look at you and decide you need to go to this specialist or that specialist or something else. The doctor doesn't have all the information, but he's got enough to know where your problems are. And I like to think of accountants a bit the same. They might not know a whole lot about marketing, but they know enough to know that you're not marketing your business particularly well and you need some marketing advice. Or they might know that your business is undercapitalized and you need further capital, and they can point you in the right direction. So I like to think of the accountant as your doctor for the business. Look for the symptoms, what the symptoms are, what the problems are, and try to advise you about where to go and get specialist help, etc.
Okay, we have a question from one of our participants, and he's asking, how do you choose the right accountant? What are the questions you need to ask your accountant to make sure that he or she can help you in making good decisions about your business, not just doing the taxes?
Yeah, look, that's very difficult. I think if you know somebody who's got a good accountant, word of mouth is probably the best way. But I think you just need to sit down and talk to them. I think if you're talking to an accountant for half an hour, let's say, you'll get an idea of whether their focus is on your tax, it's on the compliance work, etc., or whether they're actually interested in your business, whether they seem to have an understanding of the marketing and the product and where you might take the business. So I really think a lot of it is just sitting down, being prepared to have a half-hour session with the accountant and just see what sort of feedback you get. Again, it's a bit like going to a doctor. So some doctors you just feel comfortable with and some you don't. And you've got to find the one that works for you.
So do you think there's a difference between the way large companies service startups and the way a small accounting firm would service the startup?
Look, the large companies, I think, have got more facilities. If you want to list on the share market or stock market, you're probably better off going through a large company. But in the early days, when you're just getting your business off the ground, I think that could be pretty daunting, walking into PricewaterhouseCoopers. You're probably better off in the early stages trying to find a small, medium tier accounting firm. But if your business is growing rapidly and you do want to list on the stock market, etc., or have a public float, I think that's the time where you need to be thinking about one of the larger firms. That would be my thoughts anyway.
Okay.
Talk to your accountant first. I've heard so many accountants that have made the comment, the clients come to see me, but they've already entered the lease for this premise, or they've already bought all this, and now they're talking to me, and it's too late. I would have done it differently. I would have structured things differently or whatever. So think very carefully. If you do get money, or you've got money from family and friends, think very carefully before you go and buy that piece of equipment, or before you sign up to that lease. Be sure that that's what you want, because money's hard to come by, and you don't want to waste it. But at some stage, you've got to take the risk, and you've got to do it. But just do your homework first, and get some advice first before you sign on the dotted line, because accountants understand business plans, and most people don't. I mean, they're doing it. And the other thing with business plans that I think is disappointing sometimes is people think it's a necessary evil. They think, I've got to do a business plan for the bank. And they kind of do it, and then they shove it in the bottom drawer and never refer to it. A business plan should be something that is continually updated and evolving, because businesses change, the economy goes up and down. What you need to do changes. You need to evolve with movements in the market, etc. And that plan should be constantly being updated. And
that's what corporations do. They update their plans all the time, and they submit quarterly reports all the time. So they're on it all the time. But small businesses, they forget about it. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I have one more question here for you. Do you think there is a difference in, going back to the other area, the equity funding, do you think there is a difference in raising funds for women? You already mentioned that you didn't think there was any discrimination to women in terms of debt funding, but what are your views in equity funding? Do you think there's some discrimination around that? Do you have any information about that?
Look, I don't know, because there's not been much research, and there's very little information available. I remember with the Diana conference you referred to some years ago, when I came back from that very first conference, and this was the issue they raised, that it was hard for women to get equity funding. They didn't see many women-owned businesses that got equity funding. And so in Australia, I contacted a range of venture capitalists, and I found a woman that was a venture capitalist. I think she's one of the few women venture capitalists in Australia. And I asked her, what about women? Do you lend much venture capital money to women, etc.? And the point she made is, I'd love to, but I just don't get any applications. And so it's very difficult to know the answer to that, because there are just so few applications. So unless you've got a reasonable data set and sample size, you can't do any meaningful statistical analysis and draw any conclusions. So
yeah. We find the same at Sand Hill Angels. We have very few businesses that apply to be funded by us, or as part of a syndicate of a group that are led by women, or that have a women on the management team. So if the statistics are correct, in the US, 36% of businesses are run by women, and probably 50% have a woman in the management position. Probably get 2 to 3% applying. So that is probably part of something that we could change. And as you said, probably applying in itself, it's not going to make a difference. So you have to be prepared. You have to know the numbers. Probably talk to an accountant earlier on, so you can know the numbers, and be more confident as well. Not being arrogant, but being just confident in understanding that you could have that capacity to do that.
Yeah, because the venture capitalists, a lot of the judgment is based on how they perceive you as the entrepreneur or as the owner of the business. So you've got to be able to articulate your plan clearly, and show that you've got a good team around you with mixed skills, etc., that can deliver whatever it is you're doing.
And then you don't have a lot of doubts, because you can't really, can you imagine asking somebody, can you give me some money? Well, I don't know. Well, we might, but it might be difficult. So nobody's going to give you their hard-earned money if you're going to have some doubts. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, it's just not going to happen. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what is the future for women and entrepreneurship? Where do you think we're heading?
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of upside. I think it's the big growth area, because, with the economies around the world the way they are, most families need two income streams, and you know, a lot of women find that there's more flexibility if they've got their own business. They can, you know, they can work in the evenings at home and do all the paperwork and have time to go off and pick up the kids. In fact, it's one of the reasons I actually left Price Waterhouse to become an academic, because it was the flexibility, because I like to pick up the kids after school because my wife was working, and I like to go and help them with their sports training after school, and just be involved in their lives. And it allowed me to do that. And then I could work in the evenings on my PhD or research or whatever. So, I think there's a lot of upside to owning your own business. Unfortunately, most small business owners work very long hours. People think it'll be easy. It takes a lot of hours, but you do have some flexibility. And so I think it could suit a growing number of women. So I think there's a lot of upside. I think I'm in the right research area.
That's great. That's great. Well, John, thank you so much for this very, very exciting conversation. So I got several tips here. Get an accountant early on. Know your numbers. Be confident, believing that you can do that. Don't believe the failure rate. There's a myth. And work towards your business. That would be the conclusions of these. Do you have any last words?
No, the only last word is focus on your business. What you do find is some people get distracted. And there's something I've learned again with my wife's business. You got to know what your market is and what your focus is. So, and sometimes that can be difficult. You can go off on tangents and lose the focus. So that's my last bit of advice. Yeah, lovely talking to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here, for listening to these on YouTube or on our other channels. We'll see you next Monday for another Wealth Talk. Thank you very much, John.